Well, thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to lecture in Pavia. I learned it's not Pavia, but Pavia. We have some Italians working in the office. That's the reason why. What I wanted to do is basically very shortly introduce the office, but I would quickly touch upon, let's say, the main mission or the main vision that we have on our profession, which is landscape architecture and urbanism. And I decided for this lecture also because the theme is very much about water in places, to select 4 projects that we are doing or what we did in the city of Rotterdam, which is also our hometown. So that will be the build-up of my my lecture. To start with the team, we are around 12 dedicated designers. We're international, and some of us are educated as urban designers, others as landscape architect. And our projects, they vary from larger scale urban studies, research and design, to urban plans and public space design. This is just a collage of work we do. And in almost all our projects, as you might already saw when you visited the website, themes like climate change and loss of biodiversity or energy mitigation are important for the agenda of our office, and to integrate that into our plans is one of our main goals. Well, I'm not going to extensively share all the issues that come with climate change, but I want to start with that. This comes from the summer of 21, and basically what climate change means is that we have to start dealing with extremes. It's not only, for instance, too little water, but also sometimes too much water, and even sometimes in 1 month you have both conditions. So it's first of all how to deal with this extremes of climate change, and I think specifically where water is part of the urban configuration. I'm talking about delta cities or cities that have larger rivers or river basins. We see accumulation of problems. I'll get to that later. In our city in Rotterdam. So for me, one of the starting points, starting the Urbanisten with my partners, was the question: can we make our cities more climate sensitive, and specifically sensitive instead of climate proof? Because I think it really links to us as people and the daily living environment that we have, to not only make it climate proof but also more attractive. Well, we get to that later, but it's the way we approach our project is, first of all, then this question: can we make our cities more adaptive to climate change? And we have references from the past in which we were more in balance with nature, you might say, and our architecture was also taking in consideration the climate conditions that we were building in. And it was Darwin who said at the end, it's not about intelligence or strength, but more the adaptability that makes the difference. Well, I wanted to introduce a second hero, if you might say so, which is Jan Gehl, from Copenhagen, from Denmark, because it's relevant to not only focus on climate adaptation, but also immediately link that to our profession. So can we make our cities more livable and attractive at the same time? Otherwise, you're just only solving a problem. And Jan Gehl is an inspiration because he says we have to start with life, and life in the city. Cities are for people, and then you might look at and design on space. And finally, of course, it's also about the buildings, but it's in that order. So life first and buildings last. And that's an inspiration for me as well. So the question is, can we, and how do we do that? We need to integrate our climate-proof measures in our cityscapes. And that's what we've been doing with the Urbanisten ever since we started in 2013. We come from the city of Rotterdam. I don't know if some of you visited the Netherlands in this part of the country, but for those who didn't, it's a delta. It's the end of big rivers coming from Germany, ends up in the sea, and also has an open connection with the sea. It's a major port city, but also a regional economic center. And for the Urbanisten, it's not only my hometown. I live in Rotterdam, but it's also what we call our living lab. This is the place, this is a city where we can do our research and design. Also our realizations are located in Rotterdam. Not only in Rotterdam, by the way, we work on many other European places as well, but Rotterdam is important for us. Well, it would take a complete lecture probably to go deep into the systems and the situation of this delta city of Rotterdam when it comes to the impact of climate change. For now, it's good to know that that the city has quite a robust system to deal with flooding, to deal with drought and heat and rain. But given the more extreme situations, it's also given that the water is so prominently there, a sort of vulnerability. So if there's a city that needs to look ahead and see how to act, Delta City Rotterdam definitely is one of those places. And we did the projects there that all deal with this vulnerability, but also try to add to that a quality of space. So I'll run through 4 of the projects that we have done or are doing. The Water Square, which probably is well known to some of you. The Sponge Garden, which we realized 2 years ago, right in front of our office, and then the Tidal Park and the Hofbogenpark, both also in the city of Rotterdam. All right, I want to start with the Water Square, which is a project that was realized in 2013 or 14 in Rotterdam. And the main idea is very simple. It was innovative and groundbreaking at that time. But the idea is simply this, that you create a public space that can also flood in those situations that we have an abundance of rainwater coming into, in this case, a quite dense build-up urban district. This rainwater, I will explain a little bit further, ended up in a combined sewer in the old days. So one of the main interventions, of course, would be to disconnect rainwater falling in this area from this combined sewer to bring that into this basin that can flood. It's the simple idea. Well, to elaborate a little bit, let's first focus on the water management. There are different places that we created because we needed topography. The square was entirely horizontal and flat when we came, but we needed topography to organize this water management buffers. So we have three different spaces that all have their own catchment area of rainwater. 2 basins, they are relatively shallow and they take local rainwater from both public space as well as roofs. And then we have a bigger basin that also takes the largest part of the water from the surrounding, the biggest roofs, but also from a nearby district. So the total capacity of these 3 basins when it comes to water storage is around 1700 cubic meters. Well, very small in the image is also not only how it is organized, but also how it empties. There are 2, the shallow basins, they both have an infiltration facility underneath the pavement. Of course, that takes time, but water from there will just return into groundwater system. And the other one is the big basin that is underneath the groundwater level in Rotterdam here. And that is pumped out to a nearby canal. So it's none of the rainwater will end up in this combined sewer anymore. And that, of course, was one of the main objectives of the project, that we're not going to invest in a larger capacity of pipes and pumps, but that we're going to invest in a public space that can also handle the same amount of rainwater, but also gives quality to the district. So a few images of how it looks when the water is there. You see basins filling up. We designed a system of gutters, stainless steel gutters that were custom made, that based on gravity transport the water into these basins, so they can flood. Later on, if you have questions, I can answer them, but then we'll continue with what is as important, or maybe even more important, which is how to actively use the square. There are quite a lot of different groups of people or communities that all have their own ideas about how to use the square, and we try to organize it in such a way that there's some overlapping, but that also people will find those places and these environments for what they want to do on or around the square. A major community is the students that study in the big building that you see on the screen, also some other buildings around, and they actively use the square for their lunch breaks. Some bring their skateboards, you can play ball, and specifically the deeper theater space is also used by others. In this case, the church that has a place on the square brings out the community for open air services. They also baptize their children outside, but also skaters can actively use the square. So it's also a really nice combination of different communities that all find their place to enjoy and meet on the square. Sometimes you can also just be alone, being young or old, also possible on the square. And we try to make it as green as possible. There's still a little hard surface, and quite a lot of hard surfaces that have to do with the simple fact that we need to store a lot of rainwater. And if you have soft spaces, that will take more time to infiltrate. But we try to make it as green as possible. I want to take a second project into account that is not yet realized, but it's work in progress. And this project is called the Hofpleinlijn. It's not far from the water square. I don't know if you can see my hand moving on the screen, but the water square is situated in the south end of this long line that has a length of 2 kilometers, which is known as the Hofpleinlijn. It's an abandoned elevated railway that runs through the northern districts of Rotterdam. On street level, it's quite a structure. It's a heritage, it's a monument. Arches, there are 189 of them. They are rented out by for different entrepreneurs. And the side streets are quite dense with traffic. Then on top of the Hofbogen, it's really already, so you see that the trains are no longer running, but also all the train-related materials being moved away from the viaduct. So you have already quite spectacular views and a great walk from the city center to the outskirts of Rotterdam, or the other way around. Well, we were commissioned together with DS landscape architects and dock doctors, should mention them, to design a park on top of this viaduct. Some of you might know the High Line in New York. Well, it's not a High Line in New York. It's not going to be a High Line in New York. But if you have a simple idea of bringing a park on top of a viaduct, that fits the conversation. But we're doing a few things different from the New York High Line. And the first thing that I want to stress here is the fact that we not only make a park on top of a very small but long stretch of viaduct, but we also really make it a network park, which means that the greenification or the deep paving of the immediate surrounding streets and squares is part of the master plan, is part of the project. And that's extremely important because it is such a small stretch that some of the park activities are simply not possible on this roof. So we need the surroundings for that, but it's also relevant to restore, and we come to that later, some of the water and ecological systems in this northern district of Rotterdam. So it's a network park. And that means that this is the section that comes with that. We're not only looking at what's going on top of this viaduct, but we try to link that to the streetscapes around, see if we can increase the density of trees there, decrease the amount of hard surfaces, pavements, see if we can create nice places on the ground floor to linger and relax. But in this case also really see if we can, in private property, start working on green facades, green roofs, nesting boxes for birds and for bats, to really make it a integral park that adds to the quality of life of the people living in the northern districts of Rotterdam. So there are some images of the design as we are making it, and later get into the landscape itself. But one of the purposes that we would have is not to make it a ornamental garden, but really a part of a landscape that links to the local characteristics of the Delta city of Rotterdam. The second issue that I think is really distinctive from, for instance, the High Line, is the fact that we want to make the Hofvogelpark all-inclusive. And when I say all-inclusive, I mean that we're not only designing an environment for young and old and for rich and poor people that live around, but also for our what I will call animal friends. And that means that also look closely at what they want and that what they need to be present in our Hofbogenpark, which is a design task. Where, for instance, when it comes to the selection of vegetation and the delivering of shelter and so on and so on. So our park is nature inclusive, which means that we also create those spaces that other animals demand. We selected a few that are sort of target species. And the idea is that if you create a proper park for them, that you have quite a complete habitat or a quite complete ecosystem of flora and fauna present in your park. We work together with DS Landscape, which is important because they select the proper vegetation that delivers food and delivers shelter. Also makes it possible to lay eggs for butterflies, for instance. And what's important here is to show again this network park, because we also connect the roof landscape to larger ecological corridors. Specifically, the one in the north is extremely relevant for the city as a whole. And that's also the reason why we make it possible for animals to get up on the roof. I'll get to that in the latest slide. But hedgehog, for instance, they will have their own stairs going up to the park. This is an image of how we work with vegetation. That is, again, it of course also looks good in summer and spring and autumn, but it's also really selected to provide food and shelter. This is the autumn image. And this is some of the renders that we did to show how, let's say, this network park could be present in many different ways in the city of Rotterdam. And then last but not least, on the Hofvogelpark, I want to stress the water management. And here we took, I think, a next step in what you can do in the urban environment when you want to make a more circular water system. You might call it the city as a sponge, as the theme. What we basically want to do is on the plan on for me the left, you can see really at the corner the water square. We have quite a large urban district around the railway line as well. And what we propose to do is to gather the rainwater both from the roof itself as well as from the surrounding. And the water square is one of those places, to bring that up to the roof into the park and to clean it there in a biological filter with vegetation and with soil. And having done that, it's possible to bring that clean water into an aquifer, a seasonal storage that is an underground groundwater layer that is relatively stable. And if you have done that, it's also allowed to bring that same water that you stored back up to the park for different purposes, and that's the whole idea here. So this is the infiltration system. We bring the water up here, and then it goes through the plants, through the roots, into soil that at the end makes it possible to bring this rainwater down into this underground aquifer. And the good thing is that the water that we then bring up can be handy when it comes to watering the plants. We don't need any drinking water for that. It's self-sufficient, so we can circulate and recirculate the water to water the plants. But it's clean enough also to have it as a landscape element. So the last part of the project, we introduce a small stream that also linked with the desired species and the desired vegetation as part of our roof park. And it's even clean enough to enjoy in form of fountains. And as we all know, that water not per definition cools down, but active evaporating water like fountains, they do cool down substantially the temperatures during hot moments. So that is the second project I wanted to share. I don't know how I'm in my timing, but I will just continue, and I hear stop when the time is over. I'm still there?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
okay.
It's okay. You have your time. Don't you're not hurrying.
Okay, all right. Well, third of all, which is different typology, but as interesting, I think, as the water square and our roof park is what we call the tidal park for the Keilaaf in Rotterdam. And in that sense, it's also different because it has a different position in the Delta city. In this case, the tidal parks are all about the reconnection of the tidal waters of Rotterdam, which is still quite a serious difference in low and high tide. It's around 1.2 meters in an average situation, but it can add up to 2.4 meters in an extreme situation. So it's about reintroducing or reconnecting the city with this tidal river and with the landscapes that come with that. Sorry for the blurred image, but what you have to keep in mind is that the city of Rotterdam is not, well, it's basically this area here, but it's along 40 kilometers of harbors and waterways that are all part of this big port city of Rotterdam that we're talking about. And what we see, and that's something that is happening in other harbor cities as well, is that the harbor moves to the western, in this case, the seaside, leaving areas for other program for urban transformation in the more central parts of the city. And here the idea of a tidal park is super interesting, because at the moment these waters are basically, when you look at it from an ecological point of view, sort of deserts. They are very deep, so there's hardly any ground life on the bottom of these harbor basins. Also, the waterway itself is kept on an extreme depth, between 5 and 10 meters. And most of these harbors in the more inner city part, they are not even actively used anymore as water bodies. They're basically there without any proper use. This is the project site where we are asked to make a tidal park. It's a bigger harbor, and the waterway is here, and we are doing a first phase now, which is the white line that you see on the map. And this is the idea for the future, and it's linked to quite a dense urbanization of this former port area. A lot of the industries and the harbor activities, they already moved out. So what you see is sort of the pioneering things happening, creative industries moving in. But the end perspective is to really have a more dense, urbanized port area. And our tidal park is part of this new development. The first phase will be very much introducing a new typology. And what we wanted to do in the tidal park is to really reintroduce all the gradients that come with this delta. And it is the gradient between dry and wet and everything in between. It's also the gradient between high and low, between sweet and salt. And to visualize these gradients in a project, in this case in the tidal park, was our major objective. And not only for us humans, but specifically also make it again a nature inclusive environment, to get to that. So this is the model that we made, and we deliberately made it 3D, but also the white surface is what is under the water surface. So we start undeepening the entire last part of the harbor basin. So you can see that it's around 5 meters deep, but we bring that back to around 2 meters, which is important for the park, because that means that daylight can enter to the bottom of the water body. We can also add, in this case, wooden structures, that wood, trees, to make it possible for plant life to go down to the bottom. And as soon as you have plant life, then you also might expect smaller fish. And when you have fish, you also might expect birds and so on and so on. So it starts really at the bottom of the project. And then in this scheme, you can see how we gradually terrace up to the safe and high level of 3.6 meters above sea level. And well, depending on the tide, larger parts or only a small part of the park will flood. Well, this is interesting because then you get the gradients of different conditions for, first of all, plants and soils. Some are really underwater twice a day, so there will not be a lot of plants there, but there are quite a lot of birds, for instance, that really are interested in these kind of environments. And the higher you go up in the park, the more you have a complete cycle of animals where also small mammals will join. And not to forget, of course, the underground microfauna of fish and plants and all the animals that come around that. This is the section that we made. Here you can see how we terrace down to the lower level, but also really designed on this bottom of the harbor. Also, these elements here are quite interesting for certain animals. Anna, and last but not least, I want to share a small project that's right in front of our office. It's called the Sponge Garden. And the Sponge Garden is the result of quite a fundamental research that the Urbanisten did on the concept of a sponge city. In this case, we projected that on the city of Rotterdam. That's quite I also could lecture on that for a longer period of time, but the time is not given at the moment. So I will skip most of the research, but I want to tip on the most important principles. And the first idea about city as a sponge is that it basically works as a sponge. So it might collect abundance of water, and we talk about rainwater specifically. It could also be groundwater, but in this case we talk about rain. And like a sponge, it should and could be able to store that for a longer period of time, and to be able to return the water when it's needed. And this again has to do with all the extremes that I started my lecture, that sometimes we have too much water and sometimes we have too little water. And we have to deal with that extremes in a more natural based way than with technical infrastructures. And that's the key issue of the sponge city. So on a city scale, we're really moving from what I think is a 19th century concept for water management in urban areas, which is draining it, get rid of it as quickly as possible, to what we call the sponge city, which is to start to keep the water, start to reuse the water as much as possible, and to really bring it back to its natural environments as much as possible. And it means that of course you still have black water with effluent that ends up in the water body of the Maas, but you start thinking about how to downsize these flows of water, of black water. Definitely you need to organize it in a split system. So you have to split black water as water from toilets and so on, from rainwater, and preferably create space in the city itself, making open water. But instead of draining, it's much more interesting to see if you can reuse and infiltrate or bring back the water into a natural cycles, which simply means looking at infiltration space, in green space. It all contribute not only to the sponge city and its water management, also to a pleasant living environment and ecological values. So that's the idea of going from a draining city to a sponge city. And looking at the city of Rotterdam, we researched a lot of the issues that all come with making this system change to a sponge system. This is the sort of combining map that was looking at all the risks. First of all, it's about seepage, subsidence, flooding, but also the different soil types that we found in the city that really differ from peat, which you can find in the northern districts of the city, to clay soils that we have on the southern sides. And also it's in yellow here, areas that are already raised a number of times, specifically in the AUDe areas in which, for instance, a fast infiltration can take place. So we made this sort of a typological section through the city of Rotterdam, but this can be done, of course, in other cities as well. Going from the peat city, where seepage, for instance, is an important issue, to the single city, to the urban plateau, where you see the main river body, to the clay islands, in which water can't go away into the soil. So it's more about creating more water surfaces in this clay island environment. Well, because this was really a fundamental research on the sponge city on a city scale, we wanted to explore also what it could deliver us when we start thinking about building or making these sponge cities. So we started a very small garden, which is right in front of our office space, and we call that the sponge garden. And we sort of a laboratory for a few things that we wanted to find out. First, we have a few segments that are all about researching the speed of infiltration in landscape elements. We have what we call soil cubicles, in which we want to research, let's say, the relationship between soil, the improvement of soil when it comes to humidity and keeping water, and the vegetation that grows on top of that. See how that would perform. And then we have what we call the deep paved garden, in which it's mainly about how to make gardens or landscapes in conditions where we have very fast infiltration, for instance, in those areas that are hidden up with sandy materials. I'm not going to explain in detail, but it's quite interesting to see. This is what we call the waving wadi, which is organized in such a way that the first rain will be collected in a depression, but we quite quickly bring that to a layer which is a rock wool infiltration space. So there can be a lot of water stored underneath this hill, and then the planting can take up this water to the surface. So basically there's or not only vertical infiltration but also horizontal infiltration in these waving wadis, and we think that we can use that for many urban typologies. It could be in collective gardens, it could be at the perimeter of sports fields or infrastructures, it could also be in ornamental gardens. So this typology of a waving wadi would take more than 4 times its surface in terms of water when it really heavy rains. Could be interesting to implement in the city in many different ways. This is what we call the soil cubicles, which are mainly interesting in the gardens, because gardens most of the time were not hidden up. So they still have their original soil, and these soils are the rubble, the sand, the clay, and the peat. We added some materials like vermiculite and perlite to see if we can improve the absorption and the capacity of keeping rainwater in these different segments. Well, the research we did was that it didn't make that much of a difference. But we do think that that's an interesting further research to be done. And then last but not least, we have the deep paved garden, which is basically when you take out tiles in front of your house, the water will probably be very quickly infiltrate, but still we have what almost looks like desert vegetation, grasses, some of the plants that really perform well. So you don't need to go to a garden center to buy a different soil. You can just do it in the soil you have in front of your street. Of course, it's not only about the soil and what we add to that, but it's again also, because we're landscape architects as well, not only urban designers, about a nice planting scheme for all of these segments that provide, for instance, colors or food or an interesting capacity like bio-drainage planting. And last but not least, this is also an activity that we do with the Urbanisten. We maintain the garden. It's also an initiative by ourselves. So we were not commissioned, but this was our own idea. We did get some funding, but we now and then go to the sponge garden to maintain it. This is the water management. It was tested out 2 times to see how it works. Here you see this rock wool absorption material, and on top of that comes the hill, and then we tested it out, and it really absorbs quite quickly. All right, I'm at the end of my presentation. I think I'll stop sharing for now and then see if there are questions burning in the audience.